planet is threatened with destruction, and we who live in it with death. The heavens reek, the waters below are foul, children die in infancy, and we and the world, which is our home, live on the brink of nuclear annihilation.
After post-World War II industrialization left the economy booming, but the environment in tatters, with air quality precipitously low, President Nixon took action and created the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, the EPA, an agency specifically tasked to delicately balance economic needs with environmental protections. The creation of the agency forced a compromise between the burgeoning environmental movement and the booming economy, bringing in a new equilibrium between the two opposing forces, which gave environmentalism a much-needed voice in the U.S. government. Through its initial laws of the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Federal Fungicide, Insecticide, and Rodenticide Act of 1972, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and its later laws regarding waste disposal, public smoking, and climate change, among others, the EPA set up a cleaner, healthier future for the people of the United States. While the historian Samuel P. Hayes argues that post-1945 was when the environmental movement started, most argue that the 1960s was when it became kick-started, a period when the economy was booming. In the early 1960s, Pacific Gas and Electric tried to build a nuclear power plant on Bodega Bay, a site near the Hudson River. Unfortunately for them, a group of residents mobilized resistance against their project, fearing that it would harm their livelihoods, and it was built on seismic fault lines. Ultimately, the residents won, and it signaled a start of environmentalism. On September 26, 1962, a young marine biologist named Rachel Carson published her famous book, Silent Spring, postulating on hidden poisons in the environment and sparking environmentalism throughout the U.S. In 1968, a presidential election between the pro-business Republican nominee Richard Nixon and former Vice President Hubert Humphrey was waged, and Richard Nixon won and became inaugurated on January 20th, 1969.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office
that I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
On January 28, 1969, a day of reckoning occurred when Union Oil's oil rig exploded near Santa Barbara, sending 3 million gallons of crude oil into the area and harming many fish and wildlife. It was a total calamity and sparked an environmental rebellion. On June 22, 1969, environmental matters became even bleaker when an oil slick in the Cuyahoga River set on fire, causing fire crews to try to extinguish the water with Facing immense pressure from the environmentalists, President Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, which created the Council on Environmental Quality and established the government as the protector and not just the conservator of the environment. Russell Train, a prominent conservationist in Nixon's government, became the first chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality. On February 10, 1970, in his State of the Union address, Nixon offered support for the environment.
Clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American. If we act now, they can be. We still think of air as free, but clean air is not free.
On April 4th, 1970, feeling pressure from his base, President Nixon created the National Industrial Pollution Control Council, comprised solely of business executives. On April 22, 1970, the public face of environmentalism became revealed on the first Earth Day, masterminded by Democratic Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin and Republican House member Pete
It was as if Washington knew it was a special event and turned on spring's brightest sun for the celebration of Earth Day and a march on the Interior Department.
Shortly after the first day, on April 29, 1970, Roy Ash, one of Nixon's closest economic advisors, released an Ash Council memo that recommended the creation of a new agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. Acceding to these pressures, President Richard Nixon sent Reorganization Plan No. 3 to Congress, authorizing the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which would finally give environmentalists a voice in the U.S. government. Finally, on December 1st, 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency became created, and William D. Ruckelshaus became its first administrator.
This administration, I believe, and you, Mr. President, have shown your commitment to doing something about the environment, to ending this degradation that we have seen in recent years and starting back up the long road toward a better environment. And unless you ladies and gentlemen think I am not committed to the future of this country and to the betterment of the environment, you have only to look at these 4 children here, and you can see that their future is important to me as it is to many, many families all over the country and indeed the world.
Shortly after the creation of the new agency, President Richard Nixon signed the Clean Air Act of 1970 on December 31st. Public opposition to several draconian measures ultimately caused the EPA and industry to compromise and agreed on the catalytic converter, which would reduce air pollution levels by 85% by 1970. The following graphs from California show how air pollution levels decreased from 1970 to 1975. Specifically, nitrogen and oxidant levels fell, while air quality drastically increased. This compromise, kickstarted by the EPA, enabled industry compliance with public approval. In September 1971, in a move that garnered vast public approval, the EPA sued Armco Steel for discharging 500,000 tons of untreated wastewater into the Houston Ship Channel each day. The courts ruled that Armco Steel had to close its furnaces, but then the Nixon administration stepped in. They were discontented with how the EPA was making a firing board out of the industry. The EPA then found out that there were campaign contributions between the two, and Armco Steel agreed to a clean deal. Spurred on by the release of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, close to a decade earlier, the EPA in 1972 began examining whether or not a DDT ban was warranted. Ultimately, in a series of hearings, they found that DDT had an incredible persistence in the environment, recommended that DDT be phased out gradually, but not immediately. Ruckelshaus acquiesced to public demand and decided to ban the chemical outright. Also in 1972, the EPA introduced the Clean Water Act, which passed through Congress over Nixon's veto and set up secondary treatment systems throughout the country. As a compromise to industry, the act also allocated funds to help businesses pay for these plants.
I think that was a genuine consideration, economic decision. He thought it was, as designed, it was too expensive. It was a hugely expensive bill, it was the infrastructure bill of our time.
In 1980, under the authorization of the EPA, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which became known to the public as Superfund, and set up funds to help clean up incredibly contaminated sites throughout the U.S., such as the Hanford nuclear site in Washington and Bunkers Hill, the site of a former mining operation. These sites remain heavily polluted today, and as of now, the EPA is still undergoing cleanup efforts to help satisfy public demand for a clean environment. In 1992, the EPA issued a landmark report on public smoking that found it to be a second-class carcinogen capable of causing cancer, and this publication became instrumental in banning public smoking in public places. Since then, the EPA has released a series of educational brochures aimed at curbing smoking inside the home.
It was conclusive with a very significant confidence interval of the sort that we required from such decisions, that side stream smoke was a Class A human carcinogen.
Since 1973, in a move that had garnered vast public approval, but also industry approval, the EPA had initiated a gradual phase-out of lead from the nation's gasoline supply. Ultimately, this phase-out was completed in 1996, and the EPA administrator at the time, Carol Browner, declared, "The elimination of lead from gas is one of the greatest environmental achievements of all time." Since 1970, when the Environmental Protection Agency was founded by President Nixon, the EPA has served its purpose to protect the health of the American people and help ensure industry compliance.